Hey guys, today on the podcast, I'm going to discuss stuntmen in films, a book that seems to have really divided some people, and of course, the weekly reveal to what wonderful book I have pulled down from my to-be-read shelf. All of that and more this week on A Novel Review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, A Novel Review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature. And the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle. So let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hey guys, welcome back. My name is Seamus. I'm the host. This is A Novel Review. We talk about a lot of books on this podcast, a book a week. But before we talk about the book, we always take a moment to reflect on any mantelpiece moments, something to highlight from the week past. And this week I actually had a completely different mantelpiece moment, but then this morning I was invariably doom scrolling Instagram, which is not very good. But I came across this video talking about stuntmen in a one particular stunt scene in a film, and it was super interesting, so I actually did a bit of research further than the video, and it was discussing the stuntman from the film Live and Let Die. I've got some notes here because I actually made some notes about it. Live and Let Die, the James Bond film. There's a really famous scene where James, Mr. Bond, is sort of cornered, I guess you could say, by some crocodiles, and he famously gets away by running across their backs. It seems a bit cartoonish, I guess, but that's what he does. He runs across the backs and the crocodiles sort of snap up, and, you know, that's the scene. It's over in a very quick flash. And I think when you watch that scene, you just kind of assume that it's somehow fake. I guess maybe used, robotic crocodiles or something like that. And it turns out it's actually completely real. It was done in 5 takes. So when they were scouting for the film, they came across this crocodile farm. It was owned by a guy called Ross Kananga, and he was a huge James Bond fan, and he said, yes, you can use my crocodiles. And it turns out he actually suggested the scene. And then it's reported that no stuntman wanted to do the scene. So then Mr. Roger, this guy, decided to do the scene. And that's who you see in the scene. He's not an actor or anything like that. He's just the owner of these crocodiles. And if you go and find this video, you just got to type in, I guess, James Bond crocodile scene or something like that into YouTube. You can actually watch him do his 5 takes, and I mean, it's pretty fascinating because each time he does it, the crocodiles sort of start to clock on a bit earlier and earlier as to what he's doing, so they start snapping at him a lot earlier. Takes 1, 2, and 4 go off relatively seamlessly. He sort of makes it to the other side, to the bank, sort of, a foot lands in the water and he manages to get away. Take 3 is utterly terrifying because he falls in the water halfway in amongst the crocodiles. Which is all kinds of frightening. I would not want to be in that situation. And then, of course, take 5 is what they use in the film where he makes it through. 5 takes, apparently 197 stitches. Doesn't sound good. Paid $60,000. And then, of course, rewarded with the main villain in the film is actually named after him. So, I don't know. I just thought that was really cool and really fun to discuss because I love, stuntmen do an incredible job. I remember watching Rambo for the first time, the very first Rambo film, and there's the helicopter scene where he jumps out of the helicopter and lands in the tree, and I remember learning that someone actually did that stunt as well. And I mean, stuntmen there isn't like an Oscar for best stunt, which I think there should be because they're incredible people. They do a job that I would never want to do, but I think I'm assuming people watching a book podcast also have a certain love for film as well. They just make a film. They, real good stunts that look real are incredible. So I just sort of wanted to give a shout out to that because I thought that was incredibly cool and really fun to do a bit more research and get that little bit of extra detail about, he actually suggested it. He did the stunt himself. The main villain's named after him. I mean, pretty good payment if you ask me. Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, that would be amazing. 5-star reviews are also very much appreciated. So yeah, cheers for that. Okay, on to this book, Weyward by Emilia Hart. I actually listened to this book, which is why I don't have a physical copy of the book. Normally I have a physical copy of the book, but not today because, I listened to it. It's actually done really well for an audiobook. It's told in 3 different time periods. So there's 3 different narration voices And they do that. They get 3 different voice actors to do the 3 different narration voices. So you actually start to, I guess, understand and clock which chapter you're up to just by the sound of their voice. And that's sort of what I'm loving about audiobooks is the production value seems to be going up and up and up. And there are some incredible audiobooks out there now. And it was a really nice book to listen to. I've sort of jumped straight in. I normally do a bit of an overview. I just wanted to give that sort of backstory as to why I don't have the book, I guess. But yeah, so there's 3 different time periods. It's I guess it's kind of a difficult book to briefly do an overview because there's 3 different time periods. But basically, I guess a very, very broad overview is 3 different time periods about 3 women. The first is Kate, and that's set in 2019, and she is fleeing an abusive boyfriend, not husband. He's a boyfriend, and it's set in England, and she flees to a place called Cumbria. The second takes place in 1942, and that is with Violet. She seems to be living quite a restricted, oppressive kind of life. She's a bit frustrated because there's a war about to currently going on, and she's a young woman coming up in the world, and she's kind of realizing she doesn't have a whole lot of rights with herself, and that's kind of frustrating for her. And then the third story is taking place, it's a woman called Alva, taking place in 1619, and she is on trial because someone died and they're blaming her, and she is apparently a witch. And the book is kind of about witches, or the idea of being a witch. And that's kind of basically a brief overview. I guess that's probably a great place to jump into the main body of work, the story itself. It's a tough thing, I think, to do a story with 3 different narration voices in 3 different time periods. I think whenever I come into a book like this, I'm always wary because I think that I'm probably going to, if it's a good book, enjoy maybe one story more than another, or enjoy one aspect more than another, and that kind of then detracts me from the story itself because you've basically got half a story you don't want to be reading. And I think the difference with a story like this and a book about characters that maybe I don't like is parts of this story, especially parts of this story, because they're detracted stories, they're almost individualistic stories, and so there's not a lot of crossover, and so I feel that can detract you in a different way. That's just my opinion. A similar story to it is All the Light We Cannot See, and I really didn't care for the German boy's story in that. I was much more interested in, what was her name? Marie's story. She's the little French girl, the blind French girl. I was much more interested in her story, and so I was kind of like, I don't really want to go back to this German boy's. And it was similar with this because reading these 3 different narration timelines, one's 2019, one's 1942, and so you can kind of tell that at some point there's probably going to be a bit of overlap. And that sort of ties them together in a way that the story's working towards them in a way. Whereas the 1619 timeline, while you sort of know that somehow they're also going to link, it's going to be a much more detracted link than, the proximity that 1942 and 2019 have. And I think that detraction sort of drew me out of the story a bit more, that I was less interested in Alva's story. I think there was a few other things I didn't really like about Alva's story, but that was neither here nor there. This is just about these sort of time periods. But then on the other hand, I'm kind of uncertain because when you're writing about, I guess, witches in this particular context, where it's sort of trying to have an air of historicity and reality to it, I guess, you find that having this story from a long time ago actually draws you into the story a bit as well, because it feels like this continuation, this historicity is continued through the generations of stories. So even though, it probably went back further than 1619, we know that at least from 1619 onwards up until present day 2019, there is like a continuation of sorts. So it is really kind of this, it's not snowballing because it's not necessarily getting bigger, but it's this continued line of continuation, I think is what I'm trying to say. So I'm kind of torn because I didn't like Alva's story at all, but it also enhanced the story in a very different way than what I thought it would. I think what I didn't like about Alva's story was she's on trial for murder and they're blaming her as being a witch, which pretty much means you're a female with a brain, I guess. Witches back then using alternate medicine, but the proper medicine in inverted commas. I mean, if you've read The Yellow Wallpaper by Sarah Perkins Gilman, the doctors recommended if a woman had anxiety to lock him in a bedroom, and that'll solve everything. So alternate medicine was definitely a thing that you could push in a way that wouldn't make you crazy. But I think what I didn't enjoy about the witch story was that I didn't actually know if it was like a magical realist story, or if they were actually witches, or if they were just sort of these women that had a better understanding of what we now consider science, and that they were sort of more in tune with what bodies needed at certain points of time, which sort of gave them then advantage to healing people, which then the men didn't like, and so they were labelled witches. And it was sort of unclear for, I felt, a lot of the story as to, whether this was like a real story taking place in the real world, or whether there was sort of these elements of magical realism. And at the end, you sort of do learn that there are these elements of magical realism, but I think that sort of uncertainty also detracted me from the story itself. Nonetheless, I feel like I've started this episode just like trashing this book. I had a lot of fun reading it. I really did. And I think what makes this book so wonderful is it's incredibly divisive. I was going to say decisive, but it's not. It's divisive. And I didn't really think it at the time, but if you go and read this book, I'd urge you to read the book and then form your own opinion of it, and then go and just go to Goodreads or something like that, because it's like a war on the comments of just people either loved it or hated it. People either thought it was this really great feministic novel, sort of empowering women, or they thought it was just lazy, pointless crap, basically. And it's really interesting because I didn't really fall one way or the other. I didn't really think it was this like really strong feministic novel outside of the fact that the three narrators are women who are all sort of abused in this way. I didn't really take it as this really overtly feministic novel that I was... I don't think I'd really be concerned if it was overtly feministic, which is why I probably didn't notice it. But I also didn't think it was tactless either. There were elements that I didn't enjoy, but I don't think that's feminism's issue at all. I think that was more just the Emilia Hart's nuance with the text, I guess. Let's talk about that, actually. The characters in this seemed to lack nuance, and I think that was probably one of the bigger issues of the book, is that women were either really badly abused and mistreated, and I'm not saying women weren't abused or mistreated in the past, but in this book, every female character just seemed to be abused and mistreated and treated as an object. And every man in this book was an abuser, just doing terrible, terrible things. And it was kind of, there was a few lines that stuck out a bit, I guess, just saying sort of like men are men. And it was just kind of, it's not that I'm disagreeing that men weren't historically pretty bad to women and there wasn't oppression and all that, but it just sort of gave this very black and white reading. And I think I just prefer a bit of nuance to my characters. I do love a bit of the grey. I do love the morally grey characters. I think they're super interesting, because I think that's what makes them superhuman as well. And so that sort of a thing. But then at this stage, I was like, well, who cares? I mean, it's, I don't know if this is even a real story. It could be a fantasy story. So it's really something I didn't pay attention to that much. And because of that, I think I just really enjoyed the story. It was a nice story. I've got a quote here. So this is a quote about the word wayward as opposed to witches. And this is the quote. It reads, "We never thought of ourselves as witches, my mother and I, but this was a word invented by men. A word that brings power to those that speak it, not those that it describes. A word that builds gallows and pyres, turns breathing women into corpses." And so you can see through that quote that it's lovely writing style, beautiful writing style, lovely description, great imagery there. I guess, I think I just struggled because it sort of like was a culmination of a few things I didn't really enjoy, which was sort of black and white characters and 3 different timelines, which detracted me from the story a bit. That being said, the timelines I did enjoy were fantastic. I really, really loved Kate's storylines. I think she's about 28 at this stage in her life, and she flees an abusive boyfriend from London and goes to this place in Cumbria. And it was this really nice story because I think from the beginning, she's abused, and I think that's probably what I loved about it. She's abused pretty much from the beginning, and she's fleeing that and pursuing something better. And so there's sort of strength in that character right from the beginning. whereas someone like Violet is sort of unhappy with her life, but sort of plodding along, and then the abuse starts to happen to her. And I think that's sort of, I mean, that's definitely not nice to see, and it's definitely not nice to visit, but it was sort of the reason I preferred Kate's story was that it started from almost a position of weakness and built to this position of strength, and it was nice to transition with her, whereas the other two were sort of taken from these really different positions. And I think maybe just the air of Kate's was better, maybe just because it's set in modern day, and so I was able to sympathize with her in a different way, or an easy way, or understand her story in an easier way. Something I found really interesting when reading back on some of the comments of this book was a lot of people complained that it was overly abusive. There was too much abuse in it, which I found really interesting, and I don't really understand where that has come from. I'm not saying that there's not abuse in the story. There's a lot of abuse in the story, but I don't understand this sort of, I guess, aversion to abuse in the nicest possible way. I think, we shouldn't be shying away from reading about abuse, because we should be more worried about forgetting that abuse actually happens and has happened. And like the timelines of 1942 and 1619, like women were genuinely burnt at the fire for being witches, which is nonsense. 1942, women were still oppressed, and there's a world war going on. I mean, there's all manner of abuse going on in that timeline. Not to excuse the cousin for his actions at all, but he is suffering PTSD. So there is always abuse. And I think if we're going to read a story and suddenly go, oh, there's too much abuse in it, it's like, well, that's probably the realist aspect of the book, that, women were burnt for being witches. That's not something we should be shying away from and going, there's too much abuse here. We should just be getting a sunshine and rainbow story, because that to me is more terrifying than the actual abuse itself. If we suddenly start forgetting that abuse has happened, then it's more likely to start happening again, because we've forgotten the meaning behind it and what actually happened and the result of it and stuff like that. So I found that really interesting and kind of, I guess, slightly concerning, because this stuff happened, and, unless we're clocked on and aware of what it was like and what it looked like and what it leads to, it'll happen again. So I don't know. Interesting book. I think, a really good book club book, actually. I think it'd be really interesting to discuss with a bunch of people. 3 different timelines, I think, is always, even though I don't particularly like it, because it's tough to sort of get the 3 equal in strength and consistent. I think people will like different things for different reasons. And so I guess discussing in a book club would be that sort of fun thing to do. This is not a slander on Emilia Hart sort of writing style at all. I actually really liked her writing style and would happily read another one of her books if she does have one. I actually don't know. This was my first Emilia Hart. I just didn't particularly love this story. What would I rate it out of 5? I'd probably give it a 3. I'm happy with that. Okay, so what am I reading this week? This week I have picked up this book, Benjamin Stevenson, Everyone on This Train is a Suspect. I did not realize that this is actually book 2, but I'm about halfway through, and I can tell you it doesn't really matter. There's not been too many references or reason to read book 1, but I absolutely will read book 1 because I think it's a lot of fun. It is kind of like a Murder on the Orient Express comedy in a way. I think Benjamin Stevenson is really kind of breaking down the walls between the reader and the narrator of the story. He's very matter of fact, he's very frank, and he's addressing us. And I think he's sort of having a lot of fun with the mystery genre. He's sort of letting us know where we are in the story. He's saying, the killer's been mentioned now. Are you paying attention kind of situation? And so it's a lot of fun actually to read. It's kind of like, very Murder on the Orient Express. Someone dies on a train. It's set in Australia as well, on the Garn, which is kind of fun because I'm Australian. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. He's obviously a brilliant writer. He's got the story sort of, very delicately laid out and intricately planned, but he's also got that real good wit and humor about it. So absolutely going to finish this. Absolutely then going to have to go back and read book 1 because it's just a lot of fun, and it's nice to read a fun book every once in a while. So that is Everyone on the Train is a Suspect. If you have listened this far, please consider hitting those 5 stars. I would really appreciate it. Also, feel free to head along to the website and support the pod. And of course, thank you for your attention. So I think it's time to end this episode. And today, to take us away, I've got a lovely little quote, and it goes like this from Sid Banks. If the only thing people learned was not to be afraid of their experience, that alone would change the world.